Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of Blavatnik public lectures. My name's Hugh Price. I'm a philosopher. I'm also the academic director of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. One of the wonderful things from my point of view as a philosopher, since I became involved in CSER about 4 years ago, is the opportunity to work with such wonderful people from other fields, giants in their own fields. And I feel that there's no better manifestation of that opportunity than the opportunity I have now. I'm now going to introduce one winner of the Blue Planet Prize to introduce another winner of the Blue Planet Prize. I think there are not many chairs anywhere who can claim to have had that delightful task. So I'm very pleased to call on my colleague, Professor Partha Dasgupta, to introduce today's speaker.
Very much. So some years ago, I think, I was on a flight to the United States, British Airways. As is my wont, I wanted to read the High Life magazine to kick off, to educate myself. There was an article on climate change. This is about 6, 7, 8 years ago. A long piece in which an economist, Professor Paul Ehrlich of Stanford, was quoted. And it was, I realized that I had taught him well. He's now not known as an ecologist, but an economist. Paul Ehrlich, I'm not going to introduce him in any detail because he's internationally famous. The size of this audience tells me you know much about him. What you may not know is his great achievements as a institution builder. His writings are, of course, prolific, very famous: Coevolution, IPAT, and then lifelong work on butterflies. But as an institution builder, he should be recognized more than he is. The Department of Ecology, the ecology group in the Department of Biology is, I think, as good as they come. At last count, I think there were 6 members of the National Academy in a really relatively small department, and Paul founded the Center for Conservation Biology in it, which is extremely influential and does marvelous work. He has been engaged in conversations with economists for about 25 years now. We both served on the board of the Bayer International Institute for Ecological Economics, and so he's been well trained by Ken Arrow and others as an economist. And I like to think that he has influenced quite a number of economists to take this Earth system seriously. That influence hasn't penetrated the economics textbooks yet, by the way, I should tell you. So there's a long way to go. But it's a terrific pleasure to invite him to give this lecture. He actually is here en route from the Royal Society, where he signed the book many years after you were elected a foreign associate, or foreign member, I think you're called. So Paul, come.
Is the sound okay? Because my voice isn't. Everybody here? Good. It was, I guess now many years ago, that I realized that in the natural sciences we already knew more than enough to know what we should be doing to change the world and avoid the now imminent collapse of civilization, maybe even the extinction of our own species. And at that time, I saw that the academic ball had really gotten into the social science court. And from my point of view, that was a very wise thing to notice, because it got me to be friends with Partha Dasgupta, who hopefully you all know is short of Ken Arrow, the most distinguished economist in the world. Ken, I don't know, Partha can explain Ken, but none of us really can. Great guy. Anyway, those are the last cheery words you're going to hear me say probably this evening. The last time I was here, actually, if I recall correctly, I lectured on nuclear winter. It was in the mid-'80s. And at that time, Cambridge was kind enough to produce weather that when people want to know what nuclear winter was going to be like, I just say, go outside, take a look. But you've been much better to me this time. Ann and I have come here on a circuitous route, doing things like being at a meeting on the impact of population growth on future children, but mostly we've been engaged with other scientists looking at the issue of how you can possibly soften the collapse that's coming, or maybe even make it possible to at least partially recover from it. Really cheery stuff. But on the road, the news has been reinforcing my cheer on these things. For example, Ann and I were in Germany when Donald Trump basically cinched the Republican nomination for president. Now, if that hasn't depressed you, it means you don't know enough about it, because first of all, to do that in Germany, those of you who know the history of how Adolf Hitler got to be in charge in Germany will see incredible parallels. For example, in my lifetime, I cannot recall a US presidential candidate encouraging violence in his audience, or her audience for that matter. In other words, brand new thing there. The press, which is one of the areas where we have huge ethical problems, because in the US, the press is now, particularly TV, is just infotainment, has given Trump billions of dollars worth of publicity just because he's a loudmouth jerk. Trump followed Hitler. Hitler became very popular in the Nazi party, the NSDAP, because he was so virulently anti-Semitic. Why has Trump been so popular in the United States? Because he's virulently anti-Mexican. He's even more virulently anti-Muslim. And a lot of us are very much afraid that he will also become president of the United States, and that it's now largely in the hands of ISIS and similar organizations. When Trump started really hitting on the Muslims in the United States, his ratings jumped by something like 20 points overnight. If we have a presidential campaign in which he is running his usual show, and around November 1st, our election being early November, there's a terrorist attack in New York or LA or Washington, D.C., he'll be elected in a landslide after he announces that he will nuke every city in the world that has more than 75% Muslims. That's exactly the sort of thing he would claim. He's already bragged about his interest in using nuclear weapons, and therefore, those of you who think he's just a joke, I think, are probably hopefully you're right, but you're probably mistaken. When I start talking about Trump, I always need a little bit of gin to oil my voice, and I will do that now. Now, how is this connected to the usual population, resource, environment issues that I hope interest most of you? It's a more direct influence than you might think. For example, one of the ways that collapse is very likely in the world today is through either an accidental nuclear war or through a small, in quotes, nuclear war between India and Pakistan. On the accidental side, if you follow the literature, if you listen to Ted Postel or our friend Bill Perry, who was Clinton's Secretary of Defense, all the people who are looking at the nuclear war situation feel that the chances of an accidental nuclear war between Russia and the United States is now higher than it was at any time during the Cold War. And U.S. policy in what we're doing with the triad and what we're doing relative to Putin and have done is making the situation continuously worse, and everybody who knows anything is really nervous about it. So it's there in the background. lest I remind you from the nuclear winter days, if there is a large-scale nuclear war, society will have collapsed, period. That's it. It doesn't mean everybody will have been killed, but it means that the things that make our lives, what we're doing right now, will become essentially impossible globally. Sad thing is, if you know the literature, paper recently, 2007 roughly, by Toon et al., show that if Pakistan and India have a nuclear war using their arsenals, which are largely thought to be Hiroshima-sized weapons, 15 kilotons or so, that too would end England as a functional society through the climatic effects, to say nothing of the propagating social effects. And a lot of people think that that's not a zero infinity. You know, zero infinity problems are big things like a huge asteroid hitting the Earth. The odds of it happening are close to zero. The consequences, if it happens, are infinitely bad. Well, I'd like to think that a Russian-US nuclear exchange is now close to a zero infinity problem, but the Pakistan-India thing is more closer to a likely infinity problem. Among other things, the climate is changing, as some of you may have heard. It's getting warmer. The ice and snow of the Himalayan water tower are melting, and that's ag water that's shared between India and Pakistan. And if there's anything people like to fight over, it's water. We've already had the terrorist attack on Mumbai, which some people here don't agree, and I don't know whether that was an attempt to start a nuclear war between the two countries, but there are certainly well-known many people in both countries that would like to have a nuclear war and don't understand what it would be like. Now, there's a direct connection to climate, but I'm just curious here. I assume everybody in the room, if there's a climate denier, please stand up and then walk out that back door. But what's the worst problem we're going to face according to the British public? I'm going to make up the British public from climate change. Sea level rise, right? The oceans are going to come up. No question about it. You make the planet warmer, the oceans are going to come up. Even if there wasn't an ice cube on land, when you heat water, it expands, so water's going to come up. But, as I've said to several people already here, don't worry about it. You'll be able to walk away from it if it starts during the talk. It's a very slow process. That will inconvenience probably hundreds of millions of people by the end of the century, but that's nothing compared to what we're already seeing in the changing of precipitation patterns around the planet, because our food supply depends essentially completely, the terrestrial food supply, on the distribution of rainfall, and that's changing. Not only is it changing, it's not going to change from today's situation to tomorrow's situation. We've entrained roughly 1,000 years of constant change in precipitation patterns, even if we stop putting greenhouse gases out like tomorrow, which is unlikely. So we're facing really serious problems with agriculture that are basically unknown and undealt with, by the way, by our universities. I happen, by pure coincidence, to work for the best university in the world, called Stanford University. It has done absolutely nothing to change its approach to the world in response to the existential threats that we're concerned with here today. There are certainly many Stanford faculty members who are very concerned, but the university still basically has the same curriculum. You could stop people on campus, maybe 1,000 professors and graduate students, and ask them what they know about where their food comes from. And what's the answer you get from almost every one of them? What would you get from a professor here? The supermarket, right? That's where food comes from. Very, very few people in our societies, for example, understand that the food system is a very complicated system, that it donates something like, and again, it depends on how you do the numbers, 30% of the greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere come from the food system, and yet the biggest threat to the food system is climate disruption, which we're seeing now basically in abundance, although it's rarely discussed. How many of you have seen the pictures of the fire in Alberta? Oh, okay. How many of you had a discussion, heard a discussion on at least American TV about how those fires are part of a trend of warming and increasing fire functions connected to climate change? So you have something really ironic going on there. First of all, the media, for instance, on the Fox News network, you're not allowed to mention climate change. It's against the law, basically, there. But what's it threatening? It's threatening the oil sands. Now, they are the best indicator of the kind of thing that Joe Tainer discussed in his classic works on collapse. They're signs of diminishing returns to complexity. When you had an oil well in Texas in 1900, you got about 90 times the energy out you had to put into drilling and getting at the oil. In the tar sands, it's about 4 to 1. In other words, you've gone down from 90 to 1 to 4 to 1, and now the fire, caused in part by the greenhouse gas emissions from operations like they have there, is now threatening the operations themselves. It's never discussed. Excuse me. Let's put a few of the other little points together. Climate is changing. It's not just threatening agriculture in changing the water, the precipitation patterns, it's changing it by attacking biodiversity. You've probably seen the literature on pollination. The US figures are that pollination by insects is worth about $18 billion a year. More important, the crops that are insect pollinated tend to be the ones that have the nutrients we really need. They're not, of course, the grass is the main feeding base for calories, but they're really important in our diet. The most recent thing I've seen a couple of years ago estimates about half of the natural pollinators are gone, and the honeybee, which has replaced them over most of North America, doesn't do as good a job and is itself now threatened, as some of you may have heard, partly through our stupid overuse of certain nicotinoid pesticides. So climate change itself is attacking not just the physical basis of agriculture, but also the organisms that are critical to keeping agriculture going. Probably more important than the pollinators and much less discussed are the natural enemies of crop pests. One that has been discussed recently in the US is that bats are being wiped out now by a disease carried over from Europe. We don't know why it's so virulent in North America, but bats are absolutely critical, A, to maintaining agriculture the way it is. They devour huge numbers of agricultural pests, and they also are our first line of defense against an amazing array of viruses that are becoming very, very common, and you've heard about them here. For instance, one of the big problems in epidemiology is explaining how every single Republican candidate for president this year, their mothers had Zika virus when they were pregnant. Now, you work on that and see if you can figure out how to explain that. Anyway, loss of biodiversity is not trivial, and it raises interesting issues as well, ethical issues. And some people claim the only way to stop the route we're on to change course is to get people thinking about the ethics. For instance, is it ethical for human beings to select themselves as the species on the planet and basically wipe out, as far as we know, most of the remaining other living organisms in the universe? Do we owe anything at all to the other organisms, particularly to the other animals? The animal rights movement has been around for a long time. It's dreadfully ineffective. The trend today on the planet is to actually eat meat and eggs than previously, even though that's bad both for the environment and also in many cases, for the eaters. But there's recent work in biology, nicely summarized in a popular book by Carl Safina, S-A-F-I-N-A, about how similar to us other organisms are, particularly animals, and how they can suffer, and so on, and trying to make estimates of the slaughter of other organisms caused directly by human beings in our food processing, and of course, the slaughter that would go along if we have, for instance, nuclear war. Full-scale nuclear war will wipe out most of the other species on the planet. So big ethical issues there. Now, I haven't really talked about the most serious problems. One, which you should all be aware of, I'm actually doing something with it right here, is the spread of toxins from pole to pole on our planet. Things you learned originally in high school about toxicology turn out in recent years to have been shown to be absolutely wrong. You certainly at some point in your educations were told the dose makes the poison. And the usual example is common table salt will kill you. If you eat a gallon of common table salt, you'll die, which is perfectly true. It turns out, however, that much of the stuff we're manufacturing and releasing everywhere doesn't follow that pattern. It doesn't have a monotonic dose-response curve. It's got a weird dose-response curve, nonlinear very often, and it's worth the compounds like are probably leaching into my gin here. I don't know if they're gin soluble or not, are hormone disruptors. And so we are now have basically polluted the entire planet from pole to pole with a huge variety of compounds, none of which have been thoroughly studied for their ecological effects, almost none of which have been thoroughly studied for their direct effects on human beings, and particularly on young human beings. People who look at this closely are really scared. Among other things, they note that when you do individual studies, and you've probably read some of these, if you measure the IQs of kids who were raised upwind of the lead smelter, they have 2 or 3 more IQ points than the kids that were raised downwind of the lead smelter. Same thing if you get the kids that are born and raised upwind of where all the agricultural spraying is gone versus several points IQ difference from toxin after toxin after toxin. And the whole array, by the way, if you don't really want to have your blood analyzed, because all of our blood reads now sort of like a shelf list from an organic chemistry lab. It's also, by the way, full of micro particles of plastic that have absorbed to their surface all kinds of persistent toxins. The pieces are now small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier, although in some cases there's nowhere for them to go. But the idea is that we may be dumbing down all of humanity. These effects are everywhere. If we're dumbing, I personally didn't know. This is an idea put forth by toxicologists, but in view of the Republican debates, I think there's really now good empirical evidence that we're dumbing down humanity. Just think, we've had something like 7 of them. Not a single, even semi-important problem has been discussed in any of them. Their idea of a big deal is, should gays be able to get married? I'm often asked that in audiences like this, and I have a single answer. Hell yes, why should us straights be the only ones who suffer? I mean, come on. That's something worth discussing when we have an existential problem for our society. All right. There are other ethical issues I just want to mention. They're obvious big ethical issues we don't seem to be able to do anything about. Is it perfectly legitimate to blow up wedding parties in order to get revenge for hideous beheadings, that sort of thing? There's all the kind of standard stuff. But there are other issues like the allowing the media to just be infotainment in the United States. We have no equivalent of BBC, and I'm not sure that would be a real replacement. But should we take them morally to task for not dealing with these issues? What penalty is there paid by, for instance, Fox News for its law that you cannot mention climate change on it? Society can put people into very embarrassing positions if they're willing to do it, but people don't know what's going on. People have no idea what's going on in the world in the United States. I have yet to see any significant discussion of the hideous weather we've been having all over the states in extremes in various forms with climate change. There's no discussion of toxics. There's no discussion in the US of population size. There's no discussion of overconsumption in the media. If you're going to, by the way, and not enough in universities. Again, most of these topics are not taught at Stanford. You may learn a lot about Pericles, but you won't learn much about Trump, unfortunately. So one area where I think that we need to do is start putting pressure on the media to start actually passing on some news rather than just putting out what is basically industrial society propaganda. If you want to know when the news will be moving towards actually saying things that are honest and important, wait till they report, and you may be holding your breath for a long time, some politician who says, what a great year we had last year. We didn't grow, we shrank. We shrank by 2%. Do you realize if we do that for 10 years, how much shrinkage we can see, how we can take the pressure off the world? John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor, I forgot to set the bezel on my watch. How many hours have I been talking here? Okay, just wanted to be sure I had the full 2 hours. Was asked to comment on the Pope's encyclical, and he did so. He has a very nice, on the Office of Science and Technology Policy website, he's got a slideshow, basically a PowerPoint show, and he goes through it. It's very similar in many ways to an article that John Hart and I wrote called Two Cheers for the Pope, because the Pope says a lot of right things about climate change, but as John points out, he then doesn't talk about demographic issues, which are very important. For example, he doesn't mention that the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere. That, by the way, our society refused to adopt the Ehrlich plan for solving climate disruption, and you could still adopt it here in England, but it has to be global, and that is you simply pledge, if you never want to hear another word about climate disruption, everybody holds their breath for 24 hours. No more CO2 comes out. Promise you'll never hear anything more about climate disruption. But in the US, no major media center has ever pointed out that the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere. And from other sources, from many sources, not just from your CO2, obviously. And one of the things that is going to have to be done if we're going to survive as a civilization, is to greatly reduce the size of the population. And that is a non-trivial task if you do it humanely. If you follow the plans of the people building the nuclear weapons, of course, it can get down much faster, but not as fast as you think. There's a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year by Corey Bradshaw doing the numbers and showing that even with a couple of incidents causing, I think, 2 billion deaths, there's still more people in 2100 than there is today. In other words, the momentum of population growth is sufficiently severe that we cannot humanely get even to the point of fewer people in the future than we have in 2100 than we have today. What we have today, of course, is vast overpopulation. If you just make the assumption that the present status of people, the differences in consumption and so on will hold, we're using about 1.5 Earths. In other words, we're living on our capital, drawing down our capital, not living on our interest. And that's with almost 800 million people hungry, about 2 billion people sufficiently micronutrient malnourished that they can't function properly. And if everybody were brought up to the Cambridge standard of living, you'd need something on the order of 4 more Earths. So we're busily involved in taking and using up our capital and not paying attention. It's like being able to write, saying, well, I can write a check every day on my bank account. And you say, well, how much is left in it? Don't worry me about that. Just, the important thing is how big the checks can be. So it tells you that we're already in vast overshoot. We can't solve that rapidly with controlling the population in some way or another. We can start now in moving in a direction when the population might eventually reach the level, depending on who does the analysis, that might be sustainable. Ann and I conclude somewhere around 2 billion people, maybe 1.5 billion to be safe. Professor Dasgupta has been doing a study where he comes up with a somewhat more optimistic, I think it's 3.5 billion, and he's perfectly free to be in error. And so what does that leave us to do? If we're really going to do something about the current situation, we're going to have to deal with consumption, and that is a tricky thing. Population, we know the sorts of things we'd like to start doing. One, give women everywhere equal rights and opportunities. They get them nowhere. No country in the world has women getting equal rights and opportunities, but when that happens, total fertility rates do tend to come down. Give everybody free access to modern contraception. Very important. There are a lot of dispute about exactly how much that would accomplish towards getting fertility rates down, varying from place to place. Having backup abortion, safe backup abortion. Remember, if you pass laws against abortion, you're passing laws in favor of killing women. Abortion laws do not change the rate of abortion. They just move the abortion from safe, legal abortion to quack abortion. So you can pass on to, people often ask, isn't the population problem really a Catholic problem? It really isn't. The lowest fertility rates tend to be in Catholic countries in Europe and so on. Catholics in the United States use abortion more than non-Catholics because they are pushed away from using contraception. But the hierarchy is as unethical as you can possibly be, promoting pronatalism. In other words, what you're doing basically is not just killing women with their policies, you're killing future generations of children because we can't find those other 4 or 5 Earths that we got to use. Which leads me to another ethical issue which has been raised by Jim Hansen and which I'm trying to follow here. It's high time that scientists got rid of scientific reticence and started telling the way it really is. I've been talking with colleagues now for years. Everybody thinks the population situation is desperate. Everybody thinks we're headed for a collapse. Nobody dares say it. Jim Hansen actually wrote about scientific reticence when he showed, sent a paper into a journal, and he was criticized for saying, with all the data, that it looks very much like we're going to get into the area of dangerous climate change the way we're going now. And he said, you can't use the word dangerous. And he said, it's dangerous. It's like the standard English use of the term. And he could not get around the editorial board, had to publish it somewhere else. So it's time to say it like it is. If you're fighting people having access to contraception, and if you're fighting to prevent people from having safe abortion, you're fighting to kill women, and you're fighting to hurt babies. And that's just the way it is. There's no two ways about it. When you think about what can be done about all these things, you get a little depressed. But if you look at the consumption picture, you can get a little bit cheered too. It takes a very long time if we did all the things that I mentioned on the population side and then probably put other pressures on in the way of education, maybe all sorts of things that you can do. But if you put pressure on, you can gradually change the size of the population. But that's future. We're talking 50, 100, 150 years before you see anything at all. Consumption, remember, the whole thing is a product of how many people you have and what the per capita consumption is. And the overall is what we're doing to the planet. Leave the technological side out of it for the moment. It doesn't make that much difference. So you're really stuck with doing something about consumption. And what we know about consumption is we can do a lot about it, and we can do a lot about it fast. How do I know that? How many of you remember December 7th, 1941? I'm curious. Am I the only, Ann and I, the only people in the room old enough? Yeah, Oh, all right, we got some. Nah, come on. Yeah, no. You have a wonderful makeup artist, but before December 7th, 1941, which is when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the U.S. came into the Second World War, we produced that year almost 4 million automobiles. After Pearl Harbor, we essentially produced none. We switched to producing military aircraft in huge numbers, tanks in huge numbers, cannon and machine guns and rifles and hand grenades and ammunition in even huger numbers. We developed and deployed nuclear weapons. We had rationing of all sorts of stuff. For instance, beef was rationed. One of my favorite memories from that time, about 1943, my grandparents came to visit us in New Jersey, and I would have been 11 years old, and my mother produced this fantastic standing rib roast. In our family, if you could have everybody know what a standing rib roast is? Is that what you call it in England? I can't remember. A big hunk of meat, but not boiled like in England, but actually very rare. And my grandfather said, wow, you must have used a lot of red points on that. Red points were what you had to save up to get beef. Also, gasoline was rationed. All sorts of other stuff was rationed. And my father said, no, we got it at Whirlaway. Now, none of you know what Whirlaway was. When beef became rationed, a whole string of horse meat stores opened up. And they named them Whirlaway because the last winner of the Kentucky Derby and the other had been named Whirlaway. So my father told my grandfather it was horse meat, which it wasn't. And my mother tried to correct it, but neither of my grandparents would touch it. After that, I got to eat with my father a hell of a lot of good rare beef. My father was a very clever guy. Anyway, so then in 1945, we turned the whole thing around again. Stopped making military aircraft, started making TV sets, and so on and so forth. So, and by the way, exactly the same sort of thing happened in Great Britain, happened in Japan. Didn't go quite as fast in Germany because they sort of started ahead of time. But when the time came, people really changed their consumption habits in response to things that they considered important enough. So it tells you, among other things, that it is not impossible to change consumption in ways that are really incredible. I don't think anybody here probably has suffered from a military mobilization and so on. We didn't suffer that much, but I mean, went through it because the last few wars we have sort of pushed off on other people and young people and not in our civilian life. I can't recall any example of rationing tied to the Vietnam War or any of the other wars that the U.S. has been fighting to keep the oil flowing towards you and us. But it's so. We do know you can change those things. You can change consumption very, very rapidly. If we do all that stuff, we're still stuck with a very large population. And one of the things I should always mention here in England is that work was done here by Robert May and Roy Anderson, among others, showing how the larger your population, the more vulnerable you are to epidemic disease. And of course, we are super vulnerable to epidemic disease at our present population size, pushing more and more groups of human beings into close contact with the animal reservoirs of diseases. Doing that when we have an extremely rapid transport system where we have more and more people that are hungry and therefore immune compromised and more likely to catch the disease, so that there's better chance of it leaping into the human society. And if you'll recall, AIDS was spread to all continents, I think, in a week by one steward on an airliner. So the defenses against large-scale epidemics are essentially nil, and you don't hear any discussion of the things that ought to be done. For instance, when I had scarlet fever when I was a kid, sign went up on the door, quarantined. Nobody could go in the house. Everybody was stuck. I can't remember for how long. But when did you last hear the issue of how you would quarantine people in Great Britain if a new virus showed up. Look at the things that went along with the Asian flu and some of these other things. We were really unprepared there, as in most every place, because our societies are functioning really without paying any attention to the future. We have no foresight capability, and we closed the last foresight agency the U.S. had to deal with its Congress about 10 years ago, and we're stuck with it. We are in the area, I have to excuse myself to Partha, where we're basically controlled by faith-based economics. And this is the last thing I'll discuss. Faith-based economics is a system of exchange and so on that is based on two things that are not just myths. They're things that we know are totally impossible and wrong. One is, of course, that you can grow forever on a finite planet. Our money supply is based on that. There wouldn't be any pounds in your pocket if you didn't have the idea that you could grow forever. And the other is that people make rational decisions, although I think people are beginning to drift away from that idea. But of course, the neurobiologists and some economists have gotten together and shown not only is that wrong, it's 180 degrees wrong. You can't make any decisions without emotion. And that would be a nice thing. So when you hear people saying that we're done with growth and that growth is no longer good, that growth, perpetual growth, is the creed of the cancer cell, that may be a sign things are going in the right direction. But I want to leave you, as I do most audiences, with a little bit of cheer. I haven't painted a picture that's entirely bright, right? There are some problems out there. Are we going to solve them? Well, from my own, by the way, I guarantee you there are very few advantages to being older. Forget about all that golden years crap. I mean, so the better statement was old age is not for sissies. You can hear it in my voice. But when I was a kid in the 30s, you could lynch a black person in the south of the United States, take a picture of his burning body, put it on a postcard, and put it in the U.S. mail, no penalty. And people with dark skins basically were excluded from almost everything. They were not one sport they were allowed to engage in was prize fighting, but there the New York Times could have articles about how we needed, when the champion was Joe Louis, was black, articles about how we needed a white hope to replace him. Things are different now, not as different as they ought to be, but there's been enormous change in racial relations in the United States. Nowhere near far enough, but again, if you think back to what it was like when I was a kid, a lot of change. Role of women, same thing. Second World War made huge differences. My first girlfriend when I was 8, she could become a secretary, she could become a nurse or a teacher in a primary school. That was about her choice of career. 50 years later, 40 years later, when I took my instrument rating as a pilot, my instructor was a woman, and I suspect most of you have flown on an airliner captained by a woman. So again, things haven't gone as far as a lot of us would like to see, but they've gone an incredibly long way. And some of you here may remember, I think, the most cheery thing that's happened in this sort of thing in my lifetime, and that is in 1989, none of the sophisticated people Ann and I know, none of the political scientists, none of the people in the Congress and so on, predicted that the Soviet Union would basically pack up and go away, that the wall would come down, all of that stuff. There's a book called 1989, The Year That Changed the World. It's well worth reading because it shows it was somehow the time was ripe in lots of different countries. And it came about in different ways in different countries, but it came about at the same time, and nobody expected it. So it tells you that when the time is ripe, human societies can change very dramatically. And since all of you are sort of at the front lines of these things, I think you got to think of your job is to make the time ripe as hard as you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now, we have some time for a Q&A. the way it's going to work is that we have some people with roving mics. If you'd like to ask a question, please put up your hand and I'll try and distribute the questions fairly around the room and so on. But please wait until the microphone reaches you so that people who are watching this on the video or on the live feed can also hear your question. Paul, would you like to take questions here? Or
I'd like to sit down.
Okay, so if you'd like to sit down over here, I'll sit down.
The gin gets to you after a while, you know.
Well, I should have one of those. Okay, so who would like to ask a question? There's one over here on my right. Catherine, on your left.
Hello. Thank you very much. Really interesting lecture. You talked a bit about this infotainment influencing people's behavior and how that's kind of tied in with government. It does seem like it's a kind of never-ending circle. How do you propose that may be opened and that we actually get some change by informing people in different ways and asking for different policies?
I can tell you what we're doing. Most of the people that I'm involved with think expecting top-down action is hopeless, at least until you get bottom-up action more. But there's a level that I was going to talk about, which I sort of call bottom-up ethics, where people assume they have no power, even people who are in positions of power. And the example I like to use, it's an intermediate level thing, but California as a state has taken action relative to climate disruption much more than most countries, and certainly much more than the USA as a whole. On the nuclear issue, actually, Bill Perry and I were talking. Brown, the governor, is very interested in the nuclear issues as well. And Bill said to me, you know, what the hell could he possibly do? And I said, suggest to him that he start a nuclear defense program for California. If Cambridge started building shelters against the possibility of an accidental war between Russia and Great Britain, it wouldn't do you any good, but it sure would make headlines. You know, we're so serious about this, we're going to lead the way. You know, we're fed up with 7,000 nuclear weapons being held by the Russians and 7,000 being held by the U.S. and our satellites. That's ridiculous. What possible use could they be? Many years ago, about the time of the nuclear winter studies, John Holder and I got drunk. We got drunk many nights, but one night we were drunk. We did a back-of-the-envelope calculations on how many nuclear weapons, that's Hiroshima-sized bombs, 15 kilotons, not megatonnage and so on, would be necessary to end the United States or Russia as a functional entity. And the answer for the U.S. was 12, and the answer for Russia was 9. And that's when we had something like 15,000 on each side, every crossroads targeted. Why? Well, it's easy. All you have to do, first of all, you take out New York and Washington, the government's gone, the financial system is gone, and then you just hit the road intersections, the main railroad junctures, Chicago, Kansas City, and so on. And almost everybody else starves to death. People don't understand we could have that without a nuclear war. About 150 years ago, there was a solar flare that caused sparks to jump from telegraphers' keys to their bodies and so on. If it had occurred today, it would have wiped out the transformers in North America. You wipe out the transformers, you're done. You can't make more transformers without electricity. You can't pump gas without electricity, and you can't feed a population without being able to move huge amounts of food around. So virtually that would have ended the U.S. if it occurred now. And the government's, by the way, fully aware of that. So our vulnerabilities are incredible, but the idea of needing 7,000 nuclear weapons to take care of Al-Qaeda.
Over here on my left, who do we have on this side?
Hello, thank you. You mentioned access to contraception and abortion.
I'm sorry, I can't. Can you say a little louder?
You talked about access to contraception and abortion. And do you think government should actively encourage people to have less children around the world?
Would actively have, China certainly actively work to have fewer children. I think governments will do whatever they think the people will push them into doing. But it's, obviously there will be counterforces if you go for fewer children. Although I keep thinking of a very good friend of Anne's and mine, who we met her, she wanted to have 12 children. By the time she'd seen actually 2, she said, 2's enough,
Yes, down at the front here.
Hey there, thank you very much for the talk. I'm Bagayev, a very good makeup artist. I also work in public health as a doctor. Sorry, let me try again. I work in public health as a doctor. So I'm quite surprised by your remarks about human health getting worse and the issue about toxins and so on, because when you look in the UK, in the US, in fact in any country in the globe over the last century, lifespan has doubled and child mortality is usually more than halved. And this has been basically monotonic across time. Even massive things like the HIV pandemic only partially blunted this upward trend. So if you want to be a Whig historian with respect to human health, you've got quite good data to go on. And I wonder, maybe a little bit too pessimistic, which I'm sure you often get this, because when you look at lots of other aspects of the trends in human society, many things are allegedly getting better. GDP, which I know you hate, is going up, crop yields are going up, and so on and so on and so forth. This doesn't obviously mean that everything is rosy, everything will always continue getting better. But I wondered, what would you say to the optimists who sort of go, oh yeah, there are problems, but hopefully we'll manage to sort of settle them, and there's no risk of or no significant risk of dramatic worldwide collapse and doom and gloom?
If I understood the question correctly, it is, in many respects, things are getting better. Yeah. That's certainly true to a degree in rich countries. It's not true to a degree in poor countries. But the whole point is that we've managed what we've done on a previously untapped store of extremely concentrated energy, which has allowed us to do a lot of things. And again, if you're one of the almost 3 billion people that are not well fed out of 7.5 billion, then things are not getting good for you. Then industrialization has actually been very harmful in some respects. For example, I'm just curious, how many, I had not asked this question in Britain before, but are any of your kids wearing braces these days? Is there anybody in the room on a CPAP machine? Constant pressure. One of the things that's happened in most rich countries is malocclusion. That is jaws in which the teeth are not properly fit, so-called wisdom teeth that have to be chopped out. At least 5 of my friends, including my daughter, are on these continuous pressure flow machines because sleep apnea has become a serious problem, not only in adults in the United States, but in children. It's all traceable to the industrialized diet. We stopped breastfeeding a long time and then began to wean kids onto soft foods. The baby food industry, for example, is one of the main causes of malocclusion, jaws that are too small. If you put, and mouth breathing, if you put plugs in the nose of a rhesus monkey, its jaw will not develop properly. It'll get small and hang down. And we have, with the whole industrial food system, we've created a vast epidemic, which in the United States is being solved by, in some places, more than half of the kids being in braces, and the braces don't work. The braces just move teeth around in order to make you more attractive. But they don't cure the sleep apnea. They don't cure most of the orthodontic things, move teeth backwards and reduce the size of your airway, so you're more susceptible to sleep apnea. Then you look at the effects of sleep apnea, genuine stressor. Clear, the cardiologists are now writing about how to try and solve this problem, which is purely one of our society not looking forward and not considering what it's doing and going not to prevention, but going to cure, which is supported, of course, by practitioners. I mean, the main role, there's a paper from the National Institutes of Health on the doctor-caused epidemic of wisdom tooth surgery. It turns out the main thing you get out of wisdom tooth surgery is supporting the Lamborghini factory, which supplies the cars to the oral surgeons who make a fortune chopping out wisdom teeth, whether they need to be chopped out at all, and no thought of changing the whole process. If you look at the skulls of hunter-gatherers, there are no wisdom teeth. They have a full array of, those are just the last molars. Now our jaws don't have room for them. I probably didn't answer your question. Go on, you can have a comeback.
Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Oh, sorry. Okay, fine. But it just seems, with respect, this is like perhaps an area where you're going wrong. Because you point like a particular thing which you allege is like a big problem, like malocclusion, sleep apnea, stuff like that. Now, actually, I'm not actually sure the data really backs you up here, but be that as it may, let's accept that's a big problem. If it were a really big problem, people should be dying more frequently. Life expectancy should be going down. Life expectancy has been going up over this period. So identifying like particular like consideration which sort of go against the sort of narrative of progress don't like sufficiently undermine the story. Yes, something's getting worse, but as a whole, our health is getting better. Many people in the ancient days died because of dental infections.
Yeah.
Compare that to malocclusion, it seems things have definitely gotten better. And mutatis mutandis, most other things in health.
No argument that for many of us, things have been getting better. Somehow your argument reminds me of the guy who jumps off the top of the Empire State Building. And as he goes past the 4th floor, he says, everything is going great the way it is now. In other words, before you can show that the view that I and my colleagues take is wrong, then you've got to look at the, each case-by-case thing. Are we actually doing better or worse in here or there? Now, when I was born, there were 2 billion people on the planet. That's now the number estimated to be suffering from micronutrient malnourishment. 800 million people starving. So is that, it depends on how you look at it, but I look at it as something that we ought to be planning to do better at. And
okay, next question up on the far left up here, and then.
Thank you very much for that. I'm afraid I'm more of a pessimist like yourself over many of these things.
Or I'm sorry, I can't. I'm elderly, so I can't hear.
I'm sorry. I'm afraid I'm more inclined to the pessimistic than the optimistic, sad to say. But I was interested in a rhetorical device you used throughout your talk. And I don't know whether it was intentional or a trick of the speech or about your context, but you kept saying, no one's talking about this. No one's doing this. In Stanford, no one's on this. Now, in my experience, and maybe this is because I'm a geographer and we're really good at these things, there aren't enough. It's not changing enough. It's slow. It's frustrating. But there's a lot of organizations, of social movements, of departments, of academics who are precisely doing this. I share your pessimism about whether we can do enough and fast enough against some of the powers that be. But I was interested in that no one's with us, and I do that.
I think I agree totally with you. One of the things, the main thing that Ann and I have been working on actually for the last 10 years is called the MAHB, mahb.stanford.edu. And the idea was based, and maybe I misunderstood what you said, on the fact that there are thousands of organizations and millions of people who are concerned with what's going on in the world and want to change it desperately. And our problem, what we've seen as the problem, and most of our colleagues who've joined in this, is that there's no coordination, no general plan, and these organizations spend their time with very little other choice fighting over funds somewhere. In other words, so one of the things we've been trying to promote is if your concern is, say, housing for the poor, That's a really valid concern. If, however, we let the temperature rise 6 degrees Celsius, there's not going to be housing for anybody worth talking about. So we think that every organization ought to put 10 or 15% of its time into trying to solve the drivers of the major problem, which are too many people, too much consumption among the rich, and too little equity, making it very difficult for large numbers of people to even participate in trying to solve the problems. Now, did I dodge your question entirely?
Not entirely, but it gives me a second shot. And actually, I think you didn't answer this lady's question down here before when she said, do you believe that governments should limit reproduction? Because, I couldn't agree more with your diagnosis of the situation, although I have a bit of a problem with the population side of things. But that, it lays the ground. It's concerning for that sort of, we need a world government, we need a forceful limitations. Is there a concern that what you're saying then leads us into a potentially very reactionary set of controls in various ways?
Sorry.
I think the concern is that the responses that are needed to these problems are going to lead in the direction of sort of overly controlling governments. Is that the concern?
Well, that's part of why we're working with the mob. I agree, and I'm particularly scared when you see people like Trump, who doesn't know anything about these things, and in my view has all the wrong kinds of reactions. I think it's all too easy for a government to become too powerful and to make decisions that are not wise. Let's put it that way. On the other hand. For instance, people always raise the Chinese one-child family policy as this horrible thing. Well, the Chinese didn't look at it that way. The Chinese generally accepted it. Ann and I went to China to actually talk to Chinese women in the early part of the policy to see what their attitudes were. A secret meeting was arranged with about 25 Chinese women on this issue. And it took about 3 minutes. It started out with a surgeon saying, look, they all said, we did the economics, it's a wise policy. But then one of the women said, I'm the best neurosurgeon in this part of China, but I'll never be head of my unit because I'm a woman. And it turned into a long discussion of the glass ceiling in China. The abuses of the one-child family program, which were so widely distributed in the right-wing press in the U.S., were basically reports from the Chinese themselves. They considered them abuses, and they did things about it. Right now, we met, and one of my colleagues knows very well the guy who invented the program, and he's a population geneticist, very much involved now for the last maybe decade in China on the Valuing Girls program, because one of the effects of the one-child family in a society where boys are valued over girls was a lot of abortion to meet the one-child standard. These things are really, really complicated, and how you keep governments under control, I don't know, and I'm particularly scared now with the way our government isn't functioning, and we can't fix it. I can tell you why if you want to know.
Well, thanks for a very illuminating talk. I wonder what you think about one possible cause for optimism, which has been the decline and continuing decline of organized religion and its role in our affairs. I mean, for the whole history of human beings, at least since classical times, religion has been playing a dominant role in putting people on collision courses with other people, in restricting their freedoms, keeping women down, and so on. And although it's true that, in a sense, as religion is declining, there's actually more tolerance for other religions. We've got a Muslim mayor in London now. You might even once have been going to get a Jewish president in the United States next year. But the reason those things could happen is actually because religion doesn't really matter so much. And right across the world, and especially in the United States, there's a very rapid decline in fundamentalist belief. It opens up the people to accepting evidence-based arguments, understanding the nature of the world they live in, and so on. And all those, in the end, are going to be responsible for the kind of bottom-up ethics which you think is so important.
Well, I wish I were as I think that is generally cheery. It's been predicted for a very long time, of course. The U.S. is very special in that case. The argument made by sociologists is that Americans are so deeply religious primarily because there's no established church. When you establish a church, you then mix politics in with religion, and everybody's cynical about politics. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly true that you cannot be elected to a high government office in the United States unless you claim to believe in supernatural monsters. In Australia, you can do it. They had a female prime minister who was gay, living with her lover, and an avowed atheist. So it is possible in a Western country to eventually mature, but I don't see the signs of it in the States, and not fast enough. Not only that...
I think you're wrong. The actual evidence on the ground is that religious belief is declining. Of course, people have to pay lip service to it. I mean, you can't be Queen or King of England either without paying lip service
but
but it doesn't really matter very much.
I think if you want to organize society, you got to use quasi-religious means. I mean, we've used religion of various kinds, including capitalism, as organizing principles that have allowed us to go beyond the small group. After all, we're a small group animal. The average hunter-gatherer group was safe, and genetically and culturally, somewhere between 50 and 150 people. And if you examined the Christmas lists of the people in this audience, you'd find 50 to 150. We're having a hard time getting widely organized, and that's one thing that religion has managed to do for, as far as I'm concerned, ill much more than good. But
well, I agree, but your reactionary evolutionary psychology there is rather worrying, that somehow the things which shaped us 50,000 years ago as hunter-gatherers and the small groups we lived in, actually you're assuming that those are deep within us still and that we can't escape them.
The concern is that the kinds of things that shaped us as hunter-gatherers and living in small groups and so on, is it your view that those things are still with us and that we can't?
Oh, yeah, I mean, we've only stopped hunting, gathering something like 10,000 years. The evolution is something that goes on generation time and generation. You know, you get 5 generations per 100 years. To make really substantial changes in our behavior genetically simply hasn't occurred. And what we brought hunter-gatherer, Stone Age dentition into the industrial age, and we brought a lot of Stone Age attitudes in. On the other hand, we know very well that human beings can change. It's not a matter of us being genetically evil. There's all sorts of ways in which cultural evolution has overwhelmed genetic evolution and can do it again. The most obvious is if there's any one message coded into your DNA, it's out-reproduce your buddies. It's maximize the number of kids you have, basically. Just out of curiosity, how many women in the audience are planning to have more than 25 kids or have them already? Wow. So you're all overwhelming your genetic commands, and virtually every society we know about has restricted its reproduction. The Egyptians apparently did it using crocodile dung suppositories. Now, I don't know if they worked or not. I was going to try and get a graduate student to work on that, but my suspicion is pretty damn effective.
Okay, the person in the blue shirt in the middle here. The microphone's coming from this side.
Thanks. So I think there is a question being dodged repeatedly here. And earlier you spoke about scientific residence and the duty of scientists to tell it like it is. Are you or are you not personally in favor of a world government and coercively limiting reproduction? I don't think, by the way, that that's an evil thing.
No, the
are you
answer,
or are you not in favor of it?
the answer is if it proves to be necessary, but we haven't done the non-coercive things yet to see if they will work. But I'm absolutely, in other words, a government's job, one of its prime jobs is to see to it that the size of the group governed is adequate to the resources available and the other things. So I would be entirely in favor of starting with, coercively making women have better things. If that didn't work, whatever works. After all, I'm in favor of coercively preventing people from driving 95 miles an hour through your streets here. I'm in favor of coercively preventing people from emptying their garbage over the fence into your next yard and so on. Of course, that's the reason we have governments, is to do the things we can't do individually. But I would not start there. That's
Great.
But it may be necessary to start, if let's put it this way, if the crash is coming so soon that the size of the population is not going to become an issue worth the fuss it would take to try and do something coercively. The size of the population, everybody should understand that the population explosion is going to end. It's going to end either with a dramatic rise in the death rate or a dramatic drop in the birth rate or some combination. There is no way for it to continue. And I think we're a social animal, and we coerce each other when it becomes necessary for our common good.
Okay, yeah, I agree with all that. I just want to hear you say it out loud.
Okay, now a question at the back on the left, please.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, just on a point on that,
Could you
contraception.
speak up, please?
Yes, just to respond on the point on contraception, if you provide women with access to contraception and abortion, generally you find that birth rates drop anyway when women have the choice. But the question I wanted to ask is, you said that changing consumption is key, and I wanted to know what were the best sort of tactics you'd seen in how to change consumption, because I've worked on a number of campaigns in trying to change consumption that haven't been that successful. So if you want to try and change patterns and behaviour, what are some of your best examples on how to do that?
What do you think the best policies are for changing consumption?
Well, the first thing is you got to convince people it's necessary. We are seeing, by the way, changes in the U.S. because of the economic situation. The savings rate in the U.S. is going up. Some economists, actually, I read a column by Galbraith, I think it was just yesterday, about the sadness that GDP isn't growing because people are saving more than so on. But one of the things, which I think was already mentioned here, but I think is worth repeating, is that's a place where laws can do a lot of good. For instance, laws that people don't like can soon turn into norms. The best example of that is with smoking. When they passed laws in many places in the U.S., you couldn't smoke in bars, then you couldn't smoke in restaurants. People hated them. They just thought that was an impingement on their rights. And I was addicted to nicotine, so I can understand that too. But in Palo Alto, where I live now, if you lit up a cigarette in a restaurant, it might be illegal, but it wouldn't make any difference. People would throw you the hell out, whether it was legal or not. I mean, it's become a norm. Nobody now considers it okay to smoke where I live anyway, and some places are different. But so if you pass laws, if you can get laws passed, it's one place where if you can get leadership at the legislative level, you can make real changes. But we failed, for instance, tried in San Francisco to pass a law restricting either, I can't remember whether raising the price or restricting the size of these pure sugar things like Coca-Cola and so on, which are, we're having an epidemic of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and we so far have not been able to restrict the food industry to doing anything sensible.
Catherine, the person in the front row here.
Thank you for the talk. I was curious if you could comment a little bit on you kept talking about ethics, and there's an interesting question concerned with ethics that may constitute an existential risk, many people believe, with the upcoming rise of different types of robots, maybe artificial intelligence eventually, but at least in terms of perhaps what's coming very soon is self-driving cars, and there's the ability, for example, or the necessity, in fact, for programs to take ethical decisions in some uncertain situation, whether this car would kill this group of people, this group of people. How do you see this kind of thing developing? It's an opportunity for humanities and sciences to work together, but how do you see this in the future affecting both mankind and perhaps artificial intelligence?
The basic question is, when you're talking about ethics, what about how you program ethics into a driverless car? If it gets various kinds of choices, but that it's a very real area now in ethics. Whether it ought to be or not is another question. Cyborgs, what are the ethics for combinations of people with machinery? And we're getting more and more of that with, unfortunately, our military operations. And the issue is even discussed of what happens when a computer becomes able to take in information, make decisions, so on and so forth. There is a literature on this, so you can look up cyber ethics. I think Google cyber ethics probably if you're interested in it. My own view is that, with the exceptions of things like the driverless cars, which I think are not going to become super common, that the end of the road is close enough we're not going to have to worry about these things. That is, if we get past the things we're doing now, then I'll trust people in the future to deal with whether or not they're worried about whether the robots are going to take over. Right now, what I'm concerned about is getting everybody on the planet well-fed, secure, and so on. And but what we're doing now, right here, in a sense, is what everybody should be doing. After all, only human beings can have ethics. In other words, ethics are agreed upon standards of behavior, and if you haven't got language or syntax, you can't agree on anything. So we just don't have these discussions. I think it'd be wonderful every time if they advertised, how far they're getting on the driverless cars. If they ask some of the questions, what are the ethical things to program into those cars? Is there some point at which where the car would sacrifice the person inside it to save somebody outside it? I mean, there are all sorts of interesting questions, and it would be worth even having that discussion just to get people used to talking about ethics, which we really need.
I think we better make this oh no, I see. Let's have two more questions. So the gentleman in the front row just behind you, Catherine.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. The way you approach things is very, a lot more negative than what I usually do, so it's very interesting. So, but what I see is you kind of go in a negative approach, but then at the end you say that there's that there's a future, that there are other possibilities, and then we can do things around it to make it better and to solve all those problems that you were talking about before. So I think I have a feeling that what you're talking about is kind of trying to get people to see that there's problems to solve and that they have a possibility to actually create a difference. And so, yeah, if you just can confirm that. And then as well, you didn't talk that much about technology. And you were talking about the Second World War and the Russian, at that moment in time, you can never think that the world would be the way it is now. And my question is, wouldn't we should expect something like that in the next 50, 100 years, in which we will be able, through technology, to solve all those problems in the way we've been doing today, through the Green Revolution, that was a way to find food for everyone and all of those things?
The basic question, did everybody hear the question? No. Basically it is, can technology, are we not counting enough on technology to solve these problems? And my answer would have to be, we've done the counting. A good example is the Green Revolution, which a lot of us were very worried about when it went in place, but it was a desperate move to, we hoped, feed a lot of people, and it's had very serious consequences in restricting the main thing we need for running farming, and that is good seeds and very diverse crops. It's narrowed down our crop base so that people are desperately worried about that now. But the thing to remember about the Green Revolution was it was a technology in being. It was already in place in the rich countries and just had to be transferred to the poor countries where it was taken up very well. But the general consensus on tech...
The way I approach it is like the agricultural revolution was just like the Green Revolution was just an example. It's not it's more technology in general than the agriculture.
Well, no, that's fine.
The Green Revolution was the technology we had at that time, and technology evolves and things change. So,
Well, we don't have a replacement now, but the basic point is, I think people that look at this stuff would agree, is you need a lot of technological innovation to stay even. In other words, we're very smart. Human beings pick the low-hanging fruit first. When we industrialized, we started in that route, copper was lying around on the surface 100% pure. Now you go down a mile to get it at 0.5%. When the first oil well in Pennsylvania was put in, it went down 69 feet and hit oil. The one that blew up in the Gulf started under a mile of water and went down several more miles before it hit oil. So we do need the technologies just to say anywhere in approximate position to where we are now. The idea that there will be some miracle, cross your fingers, but I wouldn't count on it. In other words, first of all, science has learned much, much more about resource constraints. And one of the things scientists don't teach you is to turn off your blankety-blank phone. But I want to see who's... It's a robocall from Plano, Texas, in the United States. Yeah, some asshole's calling me right in the middle of a speech. Sorry, I'm impolite.
That would have been the perfect place to finish, but I promised one more person that she can have a question.
You get robocalls here too, by the way. These are just random dialings. You can get off all the lists. You can get on a list that they can't call you, except if it's a robot calling you.
It's another good example of where the laws are pushing the norms, and so they're becoming socially unacceptable.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting session. You mentioned that one of the really serious and rather neglected topics is the problem of the increasingly erratic rainfall on crop security, and that it was not enough was being done in universities. Given that we have a room here full of really bright academic people, have you come across any areas that you would like to inspire people to actually do research on connected with erratic rainfall and crop security?
I got most of it.
I'm sorry, I wandered a bit, so I'm
sorry.
How do you inspire people?
If you had a magic wand, what would you like to inspire people to do research on relating to crop security and erratic rainfall?
Okay, what would I think that we should be doing a lot of research on things on how to plan and install flexible infrastructure for handling water. Because we know that we can't plan on there being a certain regime 10 years from now that'll be permanent for the next 100 years. And in the US at least, our water handling infrastructure is in terrible shape. You know, you hear about the bridges dropping into the rivers, but the Flint thing has been one of the first on bad handling of water. The water's damned important. The only place I get accused of being a wild optimist is when I talk to earth scientists, who then say, if you really understood the water situation, you wouldn't be so optimistic. So, that's humanity getting its food and water is the most important thing we do. And how much of our time, our media, our schools, and so on, is there a course in Cambridge just on the general food system? Not at Stanford. Anyway, you've been very patient. Thank you very much.
Paul, as you were talking, I was reminded of salted caramel ice cream. And the reason that came to my mind is what was striking me was that many of the best experiences in life are that sort of combination of pleasure and pain, which is so well epitomized by salted caramel ice cream. And I don't think I've ever heard a talk which was on the one hand so deeply depressing and on the one hand so wonderfully entertaining. I'd like to thank you for that, and please join me in thanking you all again.
Great.